Welcome, everybody. Thank you to the session that is called Centering the Lived Experience to Create Solutions for Domestic Violence Prevention. We want to welcome you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us after a great lunch. I also want to thank you for wearing your masks. We know that, for us, it's been really important because of the spikes in COVID and some concerns for ourselves and our families, so we really appreciate you taking the time to wear your masks. My name is Lucia Corral Peña. I'm a senior program officer at Blue Shield of California Foundation. And today's presentation is going to be a little different than some of the other sessions that you've been to. This is a conversation, and we've designed it to be interactive. So I'll do an overview of the program that's called the Reimagine Lab, and I'll tell you why the Blue Shield of California Foundation launched this program and our partners. And then you'll hear from two of our community grantees who themselves are field leaders that took it upon themselves to innovate, to create, to address the needs, the prevention needs of some of our most vulnerable families in California. After each presentation, there will be time for Q&A to learn more about their specific projects. And then we're going to show you how to use one of the tools that they used as part of the lab. So you'll each be working with each other. And for that reason, we really appreciate you wearing your masks. You're going to get out of your seats and get in groups of folks. And we're hoping that that helps you, too, meet other folks that you may not have met yet at this wonderful conference. So as I said, today is a conversation. It's also a story. And it's a story about an experiment that Blue Shield of California Foundation launched in 2018. And it was an experiment to develop prevention solutions with creative individuals in California from both within the domestic violence field and outside it. And I think for us, that was the big risk. We didn't know how many people from outside the DV field would really care about this issue. But I'm glad to report back that there were a lot of people interested in partnering with us in this way. Before we get started, we would like to know a little bit about who is in the room. So I'm going to ask you, who is an advocate, a DV advocate? Okay, a lot of you. How many of you are working on prevention? Oh, that's a good number of you. Okay, great. How many of you focus or work with communities of color, marginalized communities, immigrant groups? Okay. And then lastly, how many of you are familiar with or have done human-centered design? Oh, one person. Wow. Okay, we're going to engage you. Okay. Great. So just a little bit about our foundation before we get to the projects, which is, so Blue Shield of California Foundation has been around for about 23 years. We have been working on domestic violence since the inception of the foundation in many, many different ways. Our vision is to advance health equity as well as end domestic violence in the state of California. And we recognized in 2017, as we were ending almost 20 years of grant making in the state of California, that we had been invested deeply in the domestic violence field. We funded every DV shelter in the state of California. We were funding different kinds of innovative services to survivors. What we were not doing is we were not doing prevention. And when we looked back and said, what can we say about or even document? What's the evidence we have that we have moved the needle on prevention? And the truth was, we weren't looking for outcomes for prevention. We were looking for survivor-centered approaches, and we could document the field was stronger, more funding, a lot of success in the field, but very little on prevention. And yet our mission is to end domestic violence. So we started asking different questions. Who are we engaging? What does prevention look like? What's the current evidence, et cetera? And after 20 years, we started making a shift. We didn't do a complete shift. We just started doing more investments in prevention. And we started with research to figure out what's the real data. And what we knew based on, we're not unaware of teen dating violence prevention, coaching boys to men, all of those great programs. But what we thought is California is very, very diverse. And in our work with culturally responsive organizations, we understood that there were huge gaps, even on the services side. So as we made this pivot toward prevention, we said, what we knew to be true is we have a strong equity value. We root our work in what we know and what our strengths are. And what we know in California is that there are a lot of community innovators. We know that people work hard to meet the needs of their communities every day, so we said let's leverage that strength and grow that capacity. And we said let's try to be bold. And as a foundation, we can be bold, and we said, but we want to be bold together. We're not going to achieve domestic violence, the end of prevention of domestic violence by ourselves, but we need new ideas. And we had done some successful, smaller, human-centered design work, so we tested it on domestic violence prevention. So that's how we got to these wonderful leaders you're about to hear from today. As a foundation in our pivot to domestic violence prevention, we did two strategic things. We decided to take a multi-generational analysis. We decided to not only focus on prevention, but recognize that domestic violence impacts more than two people, a person who's abused as well as the abuser, but also their children, families, communities, and really think about how do we create solutions that can be scaled to influence systems and societal change. So with that, we launched the Reimagine Lab. So I'll say one thing about this slide, because this is information you probably know, but in California, we did a field poll, and we said how many Californians, what we learned is 58% of Californians have experienced domestic violence at the time we took the poll. And what I mean by experience is this is not just survivors. We asked people, have you caused somebody harm in domestic violence? Do you know a close family member or friend who has experienced domestic violence, either as a victim or as somebody who's caused harm? So this number is not just, who's a victim, and it's not just perpetration. This is a bigger number because it is a bigger population of who said yes. So as I said, the Reimagine Lab focuses on prevention. We moved from, okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. We asked the fellows who I'll mention in a minute, who I'll describe in a minute, to think about not just a one relationship, but that we would make change with much bigger thinking. And that bigger thinking had to think about a relationship in the context of where those folks are, that people are not just survivors and they don't just cause harm. I'm sharing something everybody in this room likely already knows. But both victims and survivors live within families. They live within communities. They connect with faith. They connect with nonprofits. They have all these other identities. So let's leverage that for new solutions. And then lastly, we wanted to ground the work in equity. So a little bit about the human-centered design process. At its core, the human-centered design is rooted in a belief that if you are going to reach what we call a user in this process we call a user, if you are trying to reach a specific type of population, you need to engage them in solutions. And it is not about asking them to provide input. It is asking them to be co-creators with you in a solution that could impact themselves and the user community they represent. They represent. And that was the challenge we asked people. We said, this is what you're doing. There's a time commitment. Please apply for this only if you're interested in doing this kind of activity. And so the individuals, the leaders here will tell you a little bit more about the process and how they applied it to their user groups. But this is a picture of the applicants that we ended up funding. Now, we funded individual folks. They represented different sectors. So we have domestic violence, sexual assault leaders here, I'll just introduce you now. Sandra Enriquez is the executive director and CEO of our country's leading sexual assault coalition called Valor US. Valor, thank you. Valor, you may know her. They had a conference a few weeks ago. And then Sonia Adam is the executive director of the California Black Women's Health Project, a leading state coalition in doing maternal child health, domestic violence, sexual assault prevention, so many things for our state. But they are just two amazing leaders of 16. So we have in this complex group, we have other DV sexual assault leaders, but we also have a police officer. We have a young engineer, she was 24. We have a youth advocate, LGBTQ leader, an immigrant rights leader, a number of people here work in the health sector. We have there's a person here who has caused harm. We didn't get too many of those, to be honest with you, but we did pick one, controversial decision, but there you go. And then we have actually one professor, not a law professor, but a professor. So what they all had in common is a passion to end domestic violence. And so we wanted to make sure it was diverse in a number of ways. As you saw, it was racially diverse, but we were also looking for a diversity of sectors, but it grounded in a belief that we could make a difference. And really, anybody who accepted this task had to be willing to think about not what is, but what could be. And in any reimagination of anything, the challenge is to not get too bogged down in what is right now. These people are systems leaders. They're involved very deeply in the work that they do, but we needed folks to really think outside the box and think about what was possible, not what is. So the first lab, the first year was a 6-month lab, where all 16 fellows thought about the different user groups, the different prevention solutions, came up with different possibilities. They vetted them, they practiced them, they gave each other feedback. And at the end of that feedback, they had 10 ideas. And when they brought it back to the foundation, the truth was, we said, this is not ready for prime time. And part of it had to do with what was going on. In that 6 months, there were at least three, if not more, very active movements. The Me Too movement, the women's marches were influencing thinking. There was an immigrant rights movement happening. There was the Breonna Taylor incident had just sparked yet again conversations about not only racial injustice, but Breonna Taylor's, the tragedy of the tragedy of that story also brought gender into that conversation in a way that hadn't really been playing out before. So those are just 3 things. There were many other things going on, but the point is that all of that influences projects like this when you're reimagining what's possible. So when we went on to year 2, we called this the prototyping and iteration phase. And in this phase, 12 of the fellows, so 4 fell out, they decided they couldn't continue, they couldn't maintain that same level of commitment to the project. So with the 12 fellows, they took the project, several of the projects, not all 10, and they continued to prototype and iterate. And what I mean by prototype and iterate is they took their ideas from getting input and engaging user groups to the community, and they started doing things in the community, and there was an evaluation and iteration process. Every time they did something, it would come back to improve the solution that they had identified. They tested it, they played with it, and this is a quote from one of our fellows, Sharon Turner. She says, "I will always appreciate the treasure and the gift of introducing human-centered design processes to their thinking. The iteration and prototyping stage in particular was an antidote to perfectionism." And how many times do you think about, oh, you can't move forward without knowing every little thing is ready to go? And in this kind of model, sometimes good enough is enough to move on. Actually, a lot of times it's good enough to move on. And then in year 3, we moved to incubate and implement. And in this way, we started what we think are some catalytic ideas for domestic violence prevention. Sonia will speak to Anti-Violence Ventures. Their user group was Black men and boys taking the lead. And Influencers for Justice, which is the group that Sandra is leading. And she will speak to us now.
Thank you, Lucia, and I want to say thank you to the Blue Shield of California Foundation. I've spent most of my entire career working to end sexual and domestic violence, and it's been really difficult to get people to focus on the prevention aspect, and it's super important that the foundation kind of made a pivot to really expand to fund prevention efforts, so I'm very excited about that. I wanted to talk a little bit, I'm just going to go to the next slide, I get there. I wanted to talk a little bit about the opportunity to participate in Reimagine Lab. We're all so busy, and I run an organization that does national work, and it's so busy, so I took the commitment to apply to be a fellow in this lab very seriously, and about do I have the time? Am I going to be able to make the time to do what I know is really important? And I committed to doing it, and it was quite a commitment, I must say. But I'm very appreciative that we did that. Because one of the things that it allowed, which I think everybody in the room can appreciate, is time to step away from our day-to-day work and really focus. Because I think sometimes it's difficult for us to even think to reimagine anything because we're busy. We're so busy that we don't have time and spaciousness to reimagine anything. We're just going. And having worked in this field for, most of all of my adult career, I know that. And so it was super hard to do that, to step away and turn off, and sometimes they helped us by taking us to places where we didn't really have internet, so that helped a lot. But it was really important because it allowed us the opportunity to really think about things in a different way without being bogged down. I got to go do this. I have this deadline. So anyway, I just want to appreciate that. I'm really excited to introduce you to our project, which is the Influencers for Justice project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That's what we named it, because we really thought about, in terms of the human-centered design process, we were really thinking about what is it that we're working toward? What is it that we want? And we really thought about the justice pieces and obviously the piece about influencers. And I'm going to talk more about how we got to that. So this is our team. This is what we called the core team. They brought us together, and Jorge and Sharon are both people that I had met before but never worked with on a project. So the lab, brought us together with all of our ideas. Sharon is the person that Lucia just shared her quote about this need for perfection, and I think it's something that we in the movement have to really guard against, because a lot of times we want to have all of the answers before we move forward. And so it really was, the process was testing for us too, in terms of the ideas that we come, the way that we come, our experiences, places that we want to dig our heels in, etc. We all had to give. We all had to be open. We all had to consider things that were different or maybe uncomfortable for us. But that process allowed us to be much more creative than I think. And because I think that a lot of the people in the lab came from different walks and experiences, it was really interesting to hear what the police officer had to say, what the different fellows had to say, and then have them consider, because when you're in the movement for so long, you think a particular way, and because we surround ourselves by people that think like us a lot of times, so it's really great to have that kind of exposure. So I just wanted to bring Sharon and Jorge in the room and say that one of the things that we were committed to once we began to work as a team, we initially started off on different teams, but eventually we found some things that we had in common and we formed a new group. And one of the things that, or a couple of things that were really important to us is that the people that we would bring in to be, to do with the human-centered design with, we wanted them to be influencers of color, and we wanted them to be working in communities of color, with communities that are marginalized and traditionally unseen. And that was super important to us. So that became just one of the core tenets of our model and what we're doing. So one of the things that having worked in the field for so long, one of the things I've noticed about us, and I'll say us because I'm one of you all, I've been here for a long time, is that a lot of times we like to be gatekeepers. We have thoughts and opinions about who does the work and the way they do the work, and it should look a particular way, and why are they doing it that way, and why aren't they doing it this way? And we really, one of the things that became evident to us is that it's not just us. It's not the 600 people that are here. It's not the 2,000 people, however many people that are in the movement or that attend conferences. It's not just our responsibility to prevent DV. I know that we all want everyone to be involved, and yet we sometimes make it difficult for those people to get involved and come in the way that they come, right? And so one of the things that was really important to us is that we wanted to identify, we felt that it's everyone's responsibility, every single person's responsibility to prevent domestic violence. So in coming up with our model, it's about influencers. I'm about to talk about that. But one of the things that we realized is that our influencers needed to have a few things. First of all, they needed to have a reach. They needed to have a reach that I don't have, that you don't have, that we as a movement don't have. A unique reach that we cannot, get there. We can't reach those folks because we don't have that. We also wanted them to be people that were networked. So they had access to a network of people that they could, within their own sector, that they could influence. And we also needed them to have a commitment to ending domestic violence. Did they have to be experts? No, but they needed to have a commitment, have some kind of a basic understanding that domestic violence exists and that it's a problem. And in our case, we picked individuals that had already been doing something involving domestic violence prevention. So these are our original, something happened. Those are our original 3 influencers. We have a poet who is Yudelka Solano, poet and author. We have Marcel Woodruff, who's an anti-violence activist, really doing most of his work in gun violence prevention and working with people that are formerly incarcerated, et cetera. And we have a pastor. And each of us took our initial influencer, and my initial influencer is Pastor Benjamin Ortega. And he's a Christian pastor. And so some of you may say, well, we've been doing work with faith-based for a long time. Yes, we have. But I think it hasn't really taken hold, I would say, for the most part within our movement. And I believe that one of the reasons, okay, so let me just say a little bit something about Pastor Benjamin. So he's the one that I work with. And one of the reasons I really wanted to work with him is he's an Afro-Caribbean male from the Dominican Republic. He works primarily with recent immigrants. His congregation is made up mostly of Spanish-speaking, but lots of the younger generations, the kids, the teenagers, et cetera, are English-speaking as well. But Pastor Benjamin also has not just, he has a statewide reach because he's a part of a cluster of Spanish-speaking Christian-based churches in the state of California. It's a whole cluster throughout the state. But he also has an international reach. So he is a part of continuing education and setting education for other pastors. So You can see where some of the influence is starting to come in terms of people that are able to influence. So some of the things that we wanted and asked for our people, these are the 3 areas that we wanted from them in terms of their core work. In terms of organizing, we wanted them to identify who their audience would be and what their strategies would be. We knew it was prevention, but what? How? What kind of prevention? We also wanted them to be able to translate traditional domestic violence educational information into their own language and into what resonates with their people. So one of the things that was, I wouldn't say it was hard for us, it was just kind of exercising a different muscle that we're not used to doing, and that is that we needed to decenter ourselves and center them as the influencers. What did that mean? It meant that we had to take a step back and just be there to support, inspire, coach, provide with resources, education, etc., and let them. They became, and Lucia talked about it, co-creators with us. They co-created, and I would say they did most of the creating, and we were there to support and help, because obviously they're not experts there, and we were able to support and help them. But I can tell you that, well, let me just say the last one, and then deliver is really about engaging the community in prevention. We wanted to be clear that these weren't just one-shot educational workshops or gatherings, but that they were delivering multiple doses to the same audience. So whatever the audience is that they were working with, they were talking to them multiple times. Why? Because we want them to be able to change attitudes and behaviors, not just develop an awareness. We need to go beyond the awareness piece and help them to help their communities to think about this differently. You know, one of the things that the pastor does, which I think is beautiful, is not only does he have particular times when he meets with his leaders and talks to them about, especially the young leaders, the youth group, about domestic violence, about healthy relationships, about prevention, about those kinds of things. So not only does he have set times when he talks about the topic of domestic violence, but the multiple doses happen throughout his Sunday sermons. So when he's preaching on a Sunday, all of a sudden he'll come out with, God doesn't believe, and then he'll say a scripture, that domestic violence, and so he does it, he reaffirms the message on an ongoing basis, and that creates a norm. That creates a norm that, hey, that's not what the Bible says, that's not what my pastor says. And one of the things that he's shared with me is that in some of the challenges that he's seeing, see, I could never get there. I don't think any of us could get there, but he can get to these very authentic conversations with other pastors because he's one of them, because they respect him, because he speaks their language. But he said to me, Sandra, one of the issues is people want to ignore it or say go back home and deal with that because they feel insecure and don't know how to address it when it comes up. So it's easier to just kind of push it off. They're not connected into other networks and they feel the need to be the expert in everything. They don't have to be the expert in everything. They have to know enough to know this isn't okay and what can happen. So there's those pieces. And then I just wanted to say that one of the things I love about the model, and we kind of came up with this. How many of you heard of this concept of pay it forward? Raise your hand if you've heard of paying it forward. Great. We do it all the time, but we don't always recognize it. But it's this idea of whatever you gain and learn, that you have a responsibility to pay it forward, to share it with somebody else, to seed it with somebody else and not keep it for yourself. So we built that into the model, and our influencers are helping us to not perfect, but to strengthen the original idea of it. And that was, if we invest in one, then let's say that these tier ones here, what you're seeing here, those are Pastor Ben, Marcel, and Yudelka, the poet. let's just say that those are them. They then bring other people in under them, and they then do the same thing. They take on the role that our core team was taking in terms of coaching, in terms of providing the basic foundational DV 101, prevention training, ACEs, determinants of health. We give them a whole basic training that we put them through at the beginning. And then from there, they design what's going to work best, and we're always there to help support it. But then the original influencers then go on to ensure that their people don't just feel left out there, and that they keep, so it just keeps going, right? The idea is integrate this into your everyday work. It's not an afterthought, it's a part of your work. And I'm fortunate in my relationship with Pastor Ben in that he says, this is God's work, right? This isn't an afterthought. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, is doing work in a practical way and what matters in the community. So that's what I really wanted to share. There's my email address, but I'm just happy. I don't know if there's anything I left out, but I know we have time for question. But I just want to say one last thing before I sit down, and that is that we as a movement, we have to reach out, and we have to understand and recognize that we don't have not only all the solutions, but we don't know. And there are a lot of people, that poet, she has thousands and thousands of followers, and guess what? They read her books, they go watch her speak, and she's sending these messages and reinforcing to people that follow her. They're not going to listen to me. Okay, they're not going to even know me, right? But they are going to listen to her, right? Marcel, they are going to listen to him, and he's there with people that have already done something in their lives and talking to them about how they can do better and be better. So thank you very much. I'll be here for questions in a little bit.
And now we'll have Sonia Adam from the California Black Women's Health Project.
Thank you to the Blue Shield of California Foundation, and thank you to the conference for inviting us to be here. So something is happening up here, but I'm going to ignore that for now, okay? I want, and I didn't touch anything. Did you see me touch anything, right? I didn't touch a thing. Okay, so I want to tell you all that I am engaged in this work and in this project that was the Reimagine Lab, and now with this project called Anti-Violence Ventures for 4 reasons. Okay. One, I'm going to read this because it's something that I read to with all of the individuals that we partner with in our community. You all know it, but I'm going to read it because I always read it because I think it's an important reminder. Domestic violence, also known as domestic abuse, spousal abuse, battering, family violence, dating abuse, and intimate partner violence, is a pattern of behavior which involves the abuse by one person against another in an intimate relationship, such as a marriage, cohabitation, dating, or within the family. The definition, this full definition, what I call a broad definition, is what brings me to the work. The other is that I grew up in a family where my grandmother abused my grandfather, where my mother was abused by a boyfriend who she ultimately shot and killed and spent time in prison as a result of it. And I was 8 years old when this happened. And I have 2 brothers. One is younger and one is older than me. And the 3 of us witnessed this happening. And my brothers, in their lives, have never had a space or a place or any opportunity to really talk about that experience in their lives. Whereas I, as the girl in the family, did have, and it's limited, I mean, this is, 40-something years ago, but I at least had, occasional opportunities where people would consult with me, check in on me, talk to me about what happened, and then as I got older, because there is this massive and sometimes very amazing movement around domestic violence in our country for women, females, girls, ladies, women identified. There is a gigantic movement that is centered around the survivors of domestic violence. But that doesn't exist, for the most part, as you all well know, for men and boys. The third reason, Blue Shield of California, when they put out the application for the Reimagine lab, I read through it very carefully, and it focused on prevention, which was something at the time that I rarely heard people talk about. I run the California Black Women's Health Project, and we are a statewide agency committed to better health and wellness for Black women and girls through policy, advocacy, outreach, and education. And much of our work is centered around prevention. We don't live in a state, and sometimes the nation, where the healthcare system operates effectively, efficiently, or sufficiently to care for us. So prevention is a strategy that we utilize because we want to keep ourselves out of those beds. We want to keep ourselves from having to have those adverse experiences and those adverse outcomes. So when Blue Shield centered the idea of coming together in a fellowship and in a lab to talk about prevention, and there was to be an investment in that, I was like, oh yeah, I will apply. I really hope I get into this. Because it was something that I did not see, okay? And then the fourth reason is that the work I do for Black women and girls in the state of California is, it's awesome. It is my heart's work. I spent most of my career in the investment banking industry, in strategic planning for the corporate sector, and I came into work in nonprofit because I felt like, okay, I was born and raised in South LA. I'm a product of like all of the pathology that existed in the community where I grew up. I've seen it all. And yet now I live a life that's very different from that, but those things still continue to exist. So I came into this work, and I believe very strongly, and now I'm running an organization that is premised on the idea that Black women are the center and the love of the Black community. And what happens to the Black woman, so goes the family, so goes the community. I believe it very strongly. I see it and I live it. We tend to be the heads of our households, the administrative, the health heads, and our families, and those people who are around us, that fictive kin in the community. So those are the reasons why I'm in this work, why I came here today, why I worked very hard through this human-centered design project to develop anti-violence ventures. So now I'm going to try to use the microphone. Is that possible? Oh, but if I walk, then I can't change the slides, huh? Oh, look at that. Teamwork makes the dream work, right?
Yes. Okay, just change it now.
Okay, no. We don't do it on the other one. Can you hear me in the microphone? Okay, can you go back to the other one?
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, anti-violence ventures, it is a prevention approach, fully and completely. And we look at everything that centers around the community that we chose as a part of the lab. I was on a team, we chose Black men and boys. And I did that, and I supported it and advocated for it strongly in honor of my brothers and the other Black men and boys who often are left out of this conversation. So we looked at an intersectional approach because I believe very strongly that the lives of Black women and the lives of Black men, feminine, masculine, whatever, all identified, is intersectionally connected. What happens to us happens to them. What happens to them happens to us. We took a very inclusive approach to what we were doing, very inclusive, and we agreed that it was important to incentivize our community to help to develop and build a model around prevention. And then finally, the intention. with the foundation support and with the community's interest, but at the time, very little investment. Like, people are interested in it, but, and I would hear also, there's no money, in prevention, and there's certainly no money in looking at black men and boys. And I didn't believe that. And the foundation showed me that this is possible, and so I appreciate them for that. You know this. I mean, many of you have probably already seen this little post that's always out there. But we believe that black men and women, we stand together in this work, and it's important that we stand together. So I put that Robert Frost quote in there, that two roads converge, and we took the one less traveled by, because this is not the often chosen user group, and prevention is not the often chosen direction or strategy to address domestic violence. Can you go to the next for me? So the team, we created a theory of change, and we had to look at all of the possibilities and the pieces and what should go into this. And generally for us, the values were that this would be cross-gender, so men and women, feminines and males working together, that we would test the assumptions. And I mean, we tested, and we tested, and we tested. And there were some resources for it. That it would be black people centered, that was very important, unapologetically, and that's also a value of the organization. And that we would expand the field, that we would open up the door for people to step into this work, not in a traditional way, but in a way, like Sandra mentioned, that allows them to bring who they are and what they do and where they stand and their own work, and to overlay domestic violence prevention work on top and into what they do. When we shared this initially with the foundation and Lucia, listened carefully to numbers of presentations, what she said in the end was, okay, so you intend to democratize this movement. You're democratizing the movement. Yes, we're democratizing the movement. We need more voices. We need people who are intimately involved. All of the people who are intimately involved. As I read the definition, families. It's not just the way we use it traditionally. A man causes harm to a woman. We need to help her out. She needs to be rescued. We use a shelter model primarily. I don't know, I mean, I'm assuming we all know. And then this narrative shift, the narrative shift around how we would use language and what we would say. When we say domestic violence, almost 99% of the time, everyone makes that first assumption. That's why I read the definition over and over and over again, because I want to support the breakdown of that one-sided mindset, because it allows the entire rest of the domestic violence experiences to be put in the back and often just ignored. It's not money, not time, nobody's talking about it, and most people don't even really realize that, oh, I didn't know when my aunties, they would say, I didn't know that when my aunties would get together and they would fight and drag each other in the yard and beat each other to a pulp, that could be considered domestic violence. But this young man would say, but I was 7 and I would watch it happen all the time. I didn't know that when my cousins, would fight and they would engage in all types of violence, that it would start at home and then they began exhibiting that same violence in the streets. It's like, I didn't realize that there was actually a connection. And we talked so much and did so much research and learned from our community that you often do not see the violence in the home and not see the violence in the streets and not see the violence in our intimate relationships where there isn't some sort of blend or connection. You rarely see one without the other. And sometimes you see all three. It's okay. Thank you. So in the California Black Women's Health Project, we develop most of our work, and the organization's almost 30 years old. I've been the executive director, the CEO of the organization for the last 8 years, and we utilize CDEPs, Community Defined Evidence Practices, and this is across all of our work. And the CDEPs are practices that the community has said, these work for us, that's why we keep showing up. The mental health programs that we do, our community shows up for those, and the evaluations tell you all the time that they are satisfied, that they feel better, that they've learned, that they know help-seeking behavior, that all of these things are happening. The maternal and infant health work, in all of our work across the different areas. And in this work that we are doing now with Anti-Violence Ventures, we are seeing and hearing similar evaluation results. So we utilize this community-defined evidence practice, this CDEP model, in the same way that we use it in the programs that we target towards Black women and girls. And this Ubuntu concept, I'm not sure if anybody familiar with Ubuntu? Okay, all right, good. I like that because it connects us in culture, it connects us in so many ways, and it really does reflect, how we work together. So in the lab, we had 6 prototypes initially, 4 of them worked out. I call it worked out. What we determined to do was to go to organizations, agencies, individuals, entrepreneurs, to people who had a body of work where they had a target audience, it's very similar to the influencers concept, where they were working in an area that they were interested in really looking at and doing something about the violence in the community. So we asked them to overlay the violence, the knowledge of it, of course, DV 101, that expanded definitions, look at the social determinants of health, look at creating spaces for the community to come together to talk and to share about these. And we began to look at the African American Muslim community, and that was a community that had not been approached and asked about this type of thing in their community. Very powerful. And one of the things we determined for certain that we would do, it is not centered around hypermasculinity. It is not centered around men and boys, you need to do better. What are y'all doing? You need to protect Black women. What's wrong with you? What did you do? There is none of that ever takes place in any of these settings. It is centered around what has been your experience with violence? What do you see now? How has it impacted you? And what do you think are solutions to preventing it? And how do you begin to use your own voice to raise awareness and to work on normalizing an option where violence is no longer so prevalent in our lives? And we had a young group of Black men. Their tagline is making purpose popular. They do podcasts. They've done several live podcasts on the subject. We went to the Masons, which is I'm familiar with the Masons. Okay. They call themselves the father of all fraternities. We went to them. These men spend time with each other all the time, all year long, but they never talked about violence, their own experiences as either perpetrators, as victims, across the levels of violence that exist in our community. And then we found a group that is a group of young Black men who are all system involved. And the beauty of that group was they ultimately created an original song and video that we began to use. Starting with these 4, the project has grown so much. It is statewide. We have very, very extensive partnerships with the Bill Pickett Rodeo, with Black fraternities, with some entrepreneurs. We have so many great partnerships. And again, the emphasis remains on the intersections, the inclusivity of it, providing incentives to them to take this work to their communities, and of strong intention around prevention. I have time for the last one? Okay.
Yes.
All right. And we're going to share these slides with you, at least I've heard that. One of the teams came up, actually it was the TAYU that came up with this chain of violence. And this is what they said they saw and how it affected us. So that's why it's not one thing. It's all connected. I mean, like we see it across our whole lives, and it's reflected in our history, and it's so deeply rooted. And so they began to talk about, like, how do you look at it, and how do you begin to break the chains? These are our learnings. There were so many successes, but there were a few failures. There were things that worked and didn't work. And this last one, each of the tests that we did, every time there was a reminder that in our community, Black women are violent too. There wasn't a one-sided thing. It came up every time. Every time we met with a group, there were experiences where people talked about the violence that these men or boys had talked about violence they experienced from their mother or some, partner in their lives. It came up all the time, and there was a constant reminder of that. So we are now we're 2 years in. The foundation continues to support this project. It is growing. I'm very proud of it. Always excited to talk about it. We have an amazing team, and I thank you for listening to us. And this last slide is the logo. The next one.
Yes, thank you.
That's the logo that we created from this project. And so always domestic, family, and community, always bringing them together in everything that we do. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So you have a question?
You go back to the slide with the chain, please. With the chain? Yeah.
So we have about 5 minutes for Q&A, and then we're going to have you work on one of the tools that they used in the lab. But we have a question up here to the front. I'm going to invite Sandra as well.
What criteria did you use in determining who is an influencer?
Well, as I shared, we thought about what are some of the communities that we can't reach. So that was one big part. And then also, some of the other criteria that I said, working with communities of color and a person of color, and a commitment to domestic violence. They didn't have to be experts, but they just had to. So we started with those. We've expanded a little beyond that. But we really wanted to, I think, for me, I feel like there are so many people that are never going to come to us as experts because they would go someplace like their church, their congregation, their temple, and they wouldn't come to us. And so all of those folks, they may or may not be getting the responses that we need, and that in the case of the pastor, he had such a platform to really influence and help to normalize healthy relationships. And I think we've all seen that people in positions like that of influence can sometimes cause a lot of harm. And so we, wanted to identify people that were working in our communities that had a different perspective, and that had at least a little bit of experience at least, and then we did provide them with the foundational training. And I just want to reiterate that it really required for us to step back and not try and control it and say it needs to be like this, or you need to do this. It really required that we do that and that we listen to them and respect what it is that they brought forward as the approaches that were going to work best for them.
Any other questions? Yes.
So generally when we we use brother circles, like in our work with the women's organization, we use sister circles, and that's a model of engagement that's worked so successfully. So in these brother circles that we put together, we learned that the men and the boys, and they're mixed groups sometimes it's just boys, sometimes men, that they didn't want us to sit around and talk about what's wrong with you, what did you do? They wanted to talk about and especially when it would start with a couple of people, maybe we had a couple of plants and there'd be something on the screen that would move somebody. They began to talk about what happened, and memories would come up, and they began to express themselves around, how they had seen it or felt it. Like some people talked about the colors that they saw at the time. They talked about what the weather was. They talked about a song that was on the radio when something was happening. And all of these things, it's like coming back to them. They began to be able to really share in very intimate settings, what experiences they were having. And it just began to provide a transformative opportunity, for them for some self-healing, and then to notice, like, oh, other people have experienced this too. Like, we never talked, like my brothers, they were like, we never talked about this. I mean, we were 7, 8, and 9. They never have had a discussion about it until this program started. Never. It's like, we don't talk about it. But now, to be able to talk about it, I mean, and, you see your grandmother abusing your grandfather. I mean, who goes and tells, how do you reflect on something like that? And now that's what these environments have created and inspired.
Can you speak just a little bit more about what the testing process looks like in practicality?
Like what the prototyping looks. Oh, okay. So the testing.
Sonia, I'm going to ask you and Sandra both to answer that, but then that's it so that we can move to the steep.
Yeah, I mean, the testing was really, well, I want to say that the human-centered design process was, it was a stretch, and there were moments that were hard, that were difficult, and were frustrating. It was like, because I think we want to know what we're doing, that, something, and this is a process of figuring it out. You don't know. You have an idea, a potential solution that you want to reach, and then you have to engage people in testing it. So we tested a number of things. Some of them didn't work out. Like we initially started with a different audience. It wasn't influencers. Like we started with some entrepreneurs. That didn't work out too well for us. Doesn't mean that it wouldn't for somebody else, but it didn't work out too well for us. We realized we needed people that were networked already, that had a reach, and were entrepreneurs for us. We found it was just, they were too early on, like they didn't really have that yet. So we were like, okay, that's not going to work, but the idea is still there. So that's it. It's kind of testing. Some of the information that we gave the influencers early on, they came back and said that was kind of, we didn't really thought that information was kind of basic, or we thought that information was hard to understand. So we had to hear that and say, okay, we had to come up with something that is more accessible. It's not insider language. So it was that's kind of the testing process of going back and forth with whoever that user is and saying, I know we know a lot, but we obviously don't know very much when it comes to this. So it's that process and being able to embrace that process in order to come out with something, I think, really great. I want to just add really quickly that, I know Lucy wants me to go, but I just want to say that 2 weeks ago, Valor had its statewide conference, and we had 400 people there. And we had 2 of the influencers there presenting. Those rooms were packed. And I was concerned that some people from the field would reject, people from the outside with their approaches. That didn't happen at all. It was lines of people waiting to talk to them, just a great interest. So it makes me very hopeful. And that's from us. And, obviously within their own communities, I think that they're being embraced a lot as well.
So thank you both. I'm actually going to invite Sonia to come and set up the tool that you're about to test. Before I do that, though, I just want to thank these 2 leaders and really all of the fellows for stepping into a process where we were really mostly focused on who you're going to reach, and you'll define the who, and how we get there, which is valuing lived experience, but the what is still to be defined, because we want prevention solutions that are going to work for these communities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it takes courage. I think it took deep trust in the foundation to honor, you're going to resource us, you're going to follow through on your commitment. We didn't even commit to funding anything they produced, and they still did it. So I just want to thank, these 2 women represent a group of 16, and they actually now influencers, some of who we've met. but there were other young people who dove right in and felt honored that their voice was heard. And actually, as a co-creator, again, this is not input. So the testing project, the testing phase, this actually engaged them in saying, not this didn't work for me, go change it. This didn't work for us, this is what we suggest, this is what we'd like to see, and then they work with it. And that's the difference, I think, with some of the other things that we, even as a foundation, have done ourselves. But with that, Sonia, I want to invite you to come and introduce the STEEP tool. All of you should have gotten a handout on the way in. If you didn't, let me know and I'll go.
This tool, which some of you do have, and you'll be able to see it up here on the screen, this is a tool that we use as a part of the lab, and it's called STEEP, and it's used for like a kind of a foresight tool. And what we did was we utilized it to help us to look at a specific user group and to begin to think about all of the sort of social factors and influences that should be brought into a space or could be brought into a space to begin to think about a prevention solution. And so we, in our work, the same way, we always teach all of our groups about the social determinants of health. Like that's another thing we determined to normalize that for everybody so people know what it is. And then we use STEEP with our young people in particular to create it, to think about what influences, experiences with violence in our community. And so we want you all to look at these. So you got the social impact, the social influences, technological influences, environmental influences, economic and political. So that's STEEP. And you'll have it, and it'll be shared in the, I see you taking a picture of it anyway. It's okay. It's okay. And so what we would like for you all to do is to think about one of two user groups. I'm going to tell you who they are. And in a circle or however you'd like to come together, that's part of why we're glad some of you are wearing your masks. We hope you're comfortable with that. To come together and to talk about one of the user groups, so you'll pick one, and to look at these factors, and you can pick one or two of them, or if you think you have time, you can pick all five. You can go through all five of them. What of these issues and factors and experiences would help to influence you to create a better prevention model for this user group? Okay, so one user group is Latino young men between the ages of 12 and 18.
12 and 21.
12 and 21 young men. Latino between the ages of 12 and 21. The other user group is community college students. If you were looking at developing a prevention model for one of those groups and you looked at these factors, what do you think? And I'll give you an example, okay? Let me see, but not for either of those user groups. I'll give you an example for the group, for the group that our user group, Black men and boys. So in the area of technology, the youth have often cited that TikTok is a very, very powerful tool for them to use to send out messaging around this subject. And if they begin to push it, they can begin to influence what people are saying about it. So TikTok is a technology tool that can be used. Does that give you a sense? Okay, so you don't even need the pen and paper. You can think about it or write on the back and fill it in. One person can do it, and then we'd like to hear from you. So you have about 10 minutes to do this.
Yes, and so normally we would have taken at least a day, or if not two, just to identify the user groups. So
Yes.
we have to abbreviate it a little bit so you can actually use this tool. So we pick the user groups for you. One is, because we want you to report out at the end, what trends or factors did you identify? So one user group that we want you to organize your thoughts around are Latino youth, Latino young men and boys between the ages of 12 or 21, or community college students. So when you do this thing, that's who your user group is, and then you follow the instructions that Sonia gave.
Okay.
Are there any questions about the task?
And if you could work together, that'd be really good. To the greatest degree possible, that you feel comfortable with. We can use this to get whoever wants to report out.
Okay. Okay. Oh, look at you. Okay, folks, let's come together. So how was that? Anybody? Oh, I have thumbs up over there. You know me. I mean, you know thumbs up means I'm going to volunteer you. All right. So this group over here, tell us about how the experience went and maybe one trend that you chose. Oh, wait, hold on. We're coming to you. So say your user group, what trend area you chose. So your user group, what trend area you chose, and just tell us about the experience.
Chose community colleges, and we were recognizing that, first of all, it's a population that's really divergent, you know, in terms of, you got English language learners and students who are earning their GEDs, and then you had students who went to selective high schools but are doing their gen ed credits for the first 2 years at a community college. So you first have that diversity, and then you have to identify who the influencers are on campus, and those are like the professors who the students cluster around, or the person in, you know, the counseling department, and also the students who maybe had clubs or very active in different associations or teams. And sometimes if they have a deep love for the school mascot, making sure the mascot is a part of this. And then we looked at like the built environment, making sure that everywhere you went, there would be information, bathroom stalls, on the syllabus, on the printed materials. Those were some of the things that we were thinking about. And then incentives such as either you get a free college credit for going through this training, or you get a stipend. And we were recognizing that their students are like, well, this is great, but I've only got so much time and I got to take this math class and this computer class. So using the method of curriculum infusion, you know, like there's math, yoga, you know, to get kids healthy. And then it's like, let's put socially relevant lessons into an English or a social studies or a computer class.
Yeah.
So the curriculum infusion as well. And, recognizing the different gender and probably also by ethnicity as well, the different ways of clustering and communicating, and taking into account that there will be different gendered behaviors amongst the students, and then, you know, other ways that they identify and act differently. Those were some of the things. Ramen, yes, and the fact that plenty of them are living on ramen, so absolutely have to address the economic.
Thank you so much.
So a couple of reactions as the next group speaks. One is, I can see the trainers for us would have potentially said in a user group, maybe your user group is not focused enough, and maybe community college students is too big, and you have to narrow to really then go deeper on the prevention solutions you select. But that was terrific. Good job, group one. I'm going to call you group one. All right.
Hi. So, I mean, we did college students too, so it's going to be pretty similar.
Okay.
But just kind of under the social aspect, we just looked at like doing campus events around this, social media, of course, and then we know that college students are from all ages and demographics, so it's always going to be, I guess, easier, but we're also going to approach many different people with this. And then food as an incentive, so any event having food. And we had mentioned engaging by culture. So I think there was an example, like if there's like an Asian population, using Asian food and kind of just doing that way to kind of bring everyone together. For tech, just using like the student emails. So maybe if not everyone has social media, but campus emails are sent to everyone who's on that campus. And then posted on the campus. We also brought up the bathroom stalls. That's a great place. And then environment, doing like a campus cleanup to get those involved there.
Great, terrific, terrific. And again, just by the way you talked about maybe some culturally specific food, et cetera, you started breaking down the groups within the community college audiences. So great. Good job, group 2. I'm calling you group 2. Next, who else wants to share about your experience? Anybody do Latino boys and young men? All right, anybody else want to share?
I think the only thing to add, can you hear me? Yeah. Just to build on some of these great ideas, we were talking about tech with like YouTube is so popular, so how can we like really play like short videos around prevention and incorporate some of that within orientation pieces so that everyone coming in kind of starts on day one talking about prevention topics. Love the free food idea. Economics was top of mind for us as well. We kind of thought about like, can you turn this into a scholarship opportunity to get people involved? Could you turn it into a fellowship or a work study kind of environment? So just knowing these community college kids need money, and so let's value the work that they're doing to further the profession.
Great. I love economics as an entry point and incentive. Great. So give yourselves a hand. Yay! So we're going to wrap, but before we do, Sandra's going to say a few words, I'll say a few words, and then I want to make sure if you want a copy of the slides, make sure we've gotten your name and your email address. Has anybody who wants it, it'll be up here. Okay, Sandra.
Let's be over here. How about that? I just wanted to say thank you. Having spent about over 30 years of my life working on these issues, somebody asked me the other day, like, how do you do that work so long? And I think it has a lot to do with really focusing on the prevention pieces. Like, how do we prevent it? Because otherwise it's so hard. But when you're looking at, like for me, it's been extremely stimulating to engage other people, because otherwise it feels like such a huge job. But if everybody takes a part and we figure out how to invite people in and co-create with them, then that's super exciting and fun. I'm sorry, I don't know, but I just find it very stimulating and like a real possibility. So I really invite you all to, you got a little taste here of one of the tools that we used, but really invite you all to try and set aside a little time to think and be creative and find the space that allows you to do that, so that you can identify other kinds of strategies and other kinds of people, like broadening the tent, right, of how we can engage people in helping us and being a part, and how we can partner with them to really work to end this. So that's all. Thank you.
So I'll just close with just two more things. One is, it takes courage to do this work, and it takes courage because you have to challenge yourself or the people around you to ask them to not think about what is, but what could be. And I don't know how it worked out in this exercise with you individually, but I know that when we do that work, you start asking yourself hard questions about who aren't you engaging? Not how well you're doing your work, but who are you not reaching? What are you not doing? And then having creative conversations. This is not a judgment. It is, you have to ask those hard questions to get to better solutions. And so I want to really thank, again, the fellows who were willing to do that in a group setting with people they did not know, and kind of engage in that process. There were debates, and so a lot of things get worked out in that way. And the other is, I hope that you were a little uncomfortable at some point in this presentation. And the reason I say that is because disruption is part of human-centered design. You have to, in order to think differently, you're not thinking like the status quo. You're bringing something new. You're going to get uncomfortable on something. It's on something, about something, and that could be, or likely is, an indicator that you're on the right path, but it is not comfortable. And so I encourage you to get uncomfortable as we really think about ending domestic violence and engaging new people in the conversation. So thank you very much for being here.
And we'll be here for a few minutes if anybody has a question and you didn't get that answered. We'll be here for a few minutes. Thanks for